pattern. This is a global climate change emergency. That's where we're at, and we need to act on it.
But we were there 10 years ago.
Well, where we were 10 years ago is that we had lots of very bright and very capable activists and scientists, the likes of which the world has seen more and more of since then, warning us that this was further down the line. But I think that where we are now at is that luckily, thanks to a lot more responsible journalism, we're at a point where everyone realizes what's happening, and it's no longer people pointing to this far-off place in the future. Climate breakdown is happening absolutely right now before our very eyes. 10 years ago, Vanuatu and Tuvalu, small islands in the Pacific, were saying, look, sea levels are rising, the polar caps are melting, something needs to be done. And tragically, they were largely dismissed. Their concerns weren't acted on. But now that we're seeing, fires and floods in Europe itself, in the heart of if you like, the fossil fuel metropolis that drives this, people are starting to wake up, people are starting to react, and that's a good thing.
Just going to ask you about what we're seeing sadly now, the flooding, excess rain, fires. Are we going to see more and more of this? Because certainly we've been seeing more of it recently, haven't we? It is increasing.
100%. I think the challenge is that when we look at the work of thousands of really hardworking, incredibly well-credentialed scientists who put together something like what's coming out later on this morning, actually in an hour's time, the AR6 from Working Group 1 of the IPCC's report. When we look at that, what we see is predictions of 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, or even 4 degree. I don't have the number because we haven't seen it yet. But people, I think, are lulled into a false sense of security because you think, so what if my summer is 2 degrees hotter? Big deal. But that's not what that number means. It's a global average, and there'll be significant, massive, sometimes local variations. For example, within the Arctic Circle, we've seen temperatures go from minus 30 degrees centigrade in the winter or spring to plus 30 degrees centigrade in the summer. That sort of variation of 60 degrees centigrade in one season is unheard of. These are records that are being broken for a reason. Reasons we were given 10 years ago, actions that are happening now. And, there's a long list of luminaries who've made movies about it, who talks about it. We've had, the Prime Minister of Greece admit the fires in Greece are evidence, of a global climate change emergency. Governor Newsom in California has said that the heat dome, which has settled over part of his state, could not have happened without the climate change emergency that we're in. So we're seeing a real turning point, I think, in politicians owning up to the problem, what we're hoping as they own up to solutions as well.
You mentioned the media a little earlier, Chidi, and I'm just wondering, every time there is a report on a wildfire here or flooding there, should climate change be mentioned every time?
That's an exceptionally good question. So that's the problem that we've had for a very long time. Each of these events have been seen in isolation, and that's absolutely wrong. It's possible to say that you can make that mistake once or twice, or for 1 or 2 years, but to do so for a decade or two is borderline criminal. And the truth of the matter is that when you see these patterns emerging, when you see, as I said earlier on, records being broken across continents simultaneously, it's impossible to brush them aside as casual events that have happened because of the weather or the seasons. These are climate related. I think that realization, that declaration, being able to say, as Parliament in the UK did 2 years ago in May 2019, saying that there is a climate change emergency happening is profoundly important, because what that does is it pushes you to make all the policy solutions that help us get through mitigation and adaptation, that help us make a difference, that help us change the world, that help us preserve our planet and our environment. So calling those out as joined up, connected events rather than isolated ones is profoundly important, yes.
Just finally, and very quickly, if possible, on this, can't not ask you about Alok Sharma travelling around. Did he need to?
That's an exceptionally good question, and a really awkward and difficult one. So if you're Alok Sharma and your job is to reach out to 197 concerned parties, it's one of the largest groups within the UN, and so it's dispersed, it's around the entire planet. If that's your job, and you're simultaneously a climate czar, right? So it's your job to head what is effectively a decarbonization summit. Are you supposed to hold these meetings on Zoom makes sense, right? You save carbon. But Arlok has done some things that are really admirable, one of which I've got to sort of point out was last month he went out and he met some of the indigenous people in Amazonia, in Brazil, and Peru, and he spoke to them about the violence they faced from illegal logging. He spoke to them about the challenges that they might face in the future from in local governments in those regions who don't seem to care about those people, who don't seem to realize that this particular climate change emergency that we're in has its roots in ecocide and genocide that are tied in with a historic range of colonial practices that have got us into a really bad place. Now, we make mistakes, but when we know better, we do better. I think that Arlok flying out to meet remote people, to see remote regions, to talk to less developed countries about how important it is to change their development pathways in the future so that they're more low carbon, to offer support for afforestation, the opposite of deforestation, to offer support for tree planting, for water conservation, for renewable energy. Flying out to do that is so important. I'm willing to forgive the carbon footprint.
Well, I'm fascinated to hear that, because that's not a view we're hearing.
Absolutely. I don't run my thinking based on convention. I actually sort of sit out and do a cost-benefit analysis. You have to think about it very, very clearly. If you're doing routine meetings in an office and you're talking to people in New York all the time, you're talking to Paris all the time, you're talking to Germany all the time, that's completely logical. That's the right way of doing business. You do that on Zoom. But the idea that you can have a fulsome conversation with the head of Indigenous Peoples Organization in Brazil on Zoom is not correct, unfortunately. It's impractical. And my opinion, actually, is that this particular COP is so important, it's so pivotal, it's so monumentally important that we meet people face to face, that we talk, directly to each other, respectfully to each other. You can't do that very well on Zoom.
Chidi.
It's really good to talk to you, Chidi Oti Obihara. It's fascinating stuff, and I hope we talk about it again soon with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, coming up, we'll find out.